So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَغْفِرُ أَن يُشْرَكَ بِهِ وَيَغْفِرُ مَا دُونَ ذَلِكَ لِمَن يَشَاءُ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran that He will not forgive anybody who associates partners with Him. If you give the whole world in charity, it will not be accepted from you if you are associating partners with Allah. Now the reason why I mention this is the seriousness of what I'm about to speak or talk about. Each and every single person here today, it will either apply to you or it will apply guaranteed to somebody that you know, either a member of your family or a member of your friends. I'm going to be speaking inshallah about going to the cinema and watching movies and the serious implications that this have for the Muslim. The first issue, and I'm going to mention a number of issues bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, and I'm going to bring evidences from the Quran and the Sunnah. I'm just going to give you the English translation of the reference that I give, but I'll give you the reference inshallah. You can go back and you can reference it yourself as well. I'm going to mention a number of issues and how this is related to watching movies, but also more specifically to going to the cinema. If this doesn't apply to you, as I said, I'm sure everybody knows somebody here who it applies to from amongst their family or friends. The duty is upon you to go back and relay this message to them. As the Prophet ﷺ told us on his farewell message, on his final sermon, it may be that those who you relay this information to understand it better than you do. So it's our duty to relay this information. It may be that those who we tell, they understand it and they act upon it better than we will. The first issue relating to visiting the cinema and other issues or other areas like this, bowling, etc., is the element of free mixing. The element of free mixing that takes place between the males and the females, the Muslims and the non-Muslims. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands the Muslims or commands the people in Surah Al-Nur, Surah number 24, ayat 30 to 31. And He tells the Prophet alayhi salam, tell the believing men to lower their gazes and protect their private parts. That is purer for them. Verily Allah is all aware of what they do. And tell the believing women to lower their gazes as well. This is a command in this surah to both the males and the females to lower their gazes, to avoid looking at what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has forbidden. Ali ibn Abi Talib radiyallahu an, the great companion Ali, in a hadith which is reported by Al-Hakim, by Imam Ahmad, and also by At-Tirmidhi, he says that the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam said to me, O Ali, do not follow one glance with another, for you will be forgiven for the first, but not for the second. Let's put this ayah and this hadith together now. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling the believing men and believing women to lower their gazes because that is purer for them, to protect their private parts. Ali radiallahu an is saying that the Prophet alayhi salam told me, O Ali, do not follow one look with another, because you will be forgiven for the first look, but the second look you won't be forgiven, i.e. it's going to be a sin. When you look at these environments, you know, we haven't even got into the cinema yet. We haven't even watched the movie yet. And subhanallah, we are just queuing to buy tickets. And look at the element of free mixing that's going on now. The men are looking at the women. And there's no element of shame. It's just one look. And then she will look back at him. And he will look away and pretend that he hasn't seen her. And then he will look again and they will just play games. It's like a tennis. Look, that she looks, he looks, she looks, he looks, and they are looking one after the other. Imagine how many sins they are incurring, because the first sin, the first look, that was forgiven, but any look after that, that is forbidden, because she is haram to him and he is haram to her, except with nikah. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he told us in a hadith which is recorded by Al-Bukhari, the adultery of the eyes is the sight, i.e. to look at a forbidden thing. The adultery of the tongue is the talk. And then the inner self wishes and desires, and the private parts testify to that, or they deny it. So the adultery, how does adultery start? How does this this fornication start? It starts with a look. It starts with a look. And a look, he looks at her, she looks at him, and they smile. And then they exchange words. And then the Prophet ﷺ, he said, the inner self, it desires. Then that desire, that flame is ignited. And then the private parts, they either testify to it, so they go and they fornicate, or they deny it and they don't fornicate. But subhanallah, look at how strong the words of the Prophet ﷺ were. The fornication of the eyes is the sight. Of the tongue, it is the speech. And subhanallah, that leads to this desire, which is then either confirmed by the private part or it is denied. So we are only on the issue of free mixing, but look at how seriously Islam takes this issue of free mixing. But the Muslims today, we think it's just something very minor, something very, very minor. You know, she's just a friend. There is no friendship like this in Islam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَلَا يَعْلَمُ مَنْ خَلَقَ وَهُوَ اللَّطِيفُ الْخَبِيرُ. Should Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the one who created you, doesn't He know better? The one who created you, doesn't He know what is right for you? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Prophet alayhi salam have forbidden this element of free mixing. They have forbidden this element of just openly talking to those who are not your sisters or your aunties or your mothers or your grandmothers, etc. Because of the evil which it leads to. Shaitan, you may be pious, she may be pious, but shaitan is not pious. You may be practicing and you want good, and she may be practicing and want good, but bring you two together, and who is the third? Shaitan. The Prophet ﷺ, he told us that two people are never together and they are non-mahrams, except that the third amongst them is shaitan. So you may be a good person, she may be a good person, but wallahi shaitan is not a good person. He is your enemy, and he wants you to commit fornication. He wants you to disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in Surah Ghafir, Surah number 40, ayah number 19. Allah knows the fraud of the eyes and all that the breasts conceal. Allah knows the fraud of our eyes and everything that our breasts conceal. Ibn Abbas radiallahu anh, the one whom the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam made dua for him, he took him in his cloak and said, "Oh Allah, give him understanding of this religion." He was the sheikh of the Quran from amongst the companions. Ibn Abbas, he speaks about the tafsir of this ayah. Allah knows the fraud of the eyes and everything that the breasts conceal. Ibn Abbas says, it refers to a man who visits the house of a family, which includes a beautiful woman, and she passes him by. When the members of the family are not watching him, he looks at her. But when they are alert, he lowers his gaze. So imagine this. You go, or the man goes to visit this person in his house. Either he's been called for a meal, or there might be some other purpose for his visit. And he's sitting there, and a beautiful woman either passes by or she enters into the room. So when the menfolk are not looking, he is looking at her, appreciating her beauty, desiring her. But then when they are looking, he lowers his gaze. This is fraud of his eyes. His eyes are fraudulent. So Ibn Abbas says, when they are not watching, he gazes at her. But when they are observing him, he lowers his gaze. And then Ibn Abbas continues, he says, Allah knows that in his heart he wishes to see her naked, and if he could, he would commit adultery with her. This is the adultery of his heart. This is what his breast is concealing. So the fraud of his eyes is looking at her and then looking away. And what his heart is concealing, Allah knows that he desires to commit adultery with her. This is in Tafsir Ibn Kathir. Ikhwani, when you go to the cinema, when you go to these areas and people are just queuing up to buy the tickets, there's no fraud involved, subhanallah. There's no sideways glances. People are openly looking at one another. There is no fraud involved. There is no hidden glances. The people are looking one at the other, and there is no shame. It's like a cattle market. oh, isn't she fit? Isn't he hot? Subhanallah, this is how they speak. This is how they speak. And they are just gazing at one another, and there is no shame at all. Like they are animals. Like they are animals. Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah, he says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the animals with lusts and desires, but there is no reason. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the angels with reason, but no lust and no desire. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the humans with lusts and with reason. So if he follows his lusts, he becomes like an animal. But if he follows his reason, he becomes like the angels. Ikhwani, when you go to these places, these people are just so overcome with lust. It's just like a cattle market. Subhanallah. Look at how seriously the Prophet ﷺ took this issue of free mixing. If you notice, we're still on the first issue. We haven't even got into watching the movie, subhanallah. Abu Hurairah radiyallahu anh, he narrates that the Prophet ﷺ, he said, the best rows for the men are the first rows, and the worst rows are the last ones. The best rows for the women are the last rows, and the worst rows for the men are the first rows. This hadith is in Muslim and elsewhere, Abu Dawood and At-Tirmidhi. Let's examine this hadith. The best rows for the men are the first rows. The best rows for the women are the last rows. The worst rows for the men are the last rows, and the worst rows for the women are the first rows. Why is that? At the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the men used to pray at the front and the women would be behind them. So obviously the men who are in the last rows, they would be close to the women who are in the first rows. Does everyone understand that? Because of the proximity, the men who are at the end are going to be closest to the women who are at the beginning of the first rows for the women. So he said that the worst rows for the women are the first rows. And this was his way of showing us, alayhi salatu salam, the importance of this segregation and what it leads to. Elsewhere, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he told us in a hadith which is recorded by Imam Ahmad and Abu Dawood, do not prevent the women from visiting the masajid, the masjids or the mosques of Allah, but they may go out to the mosques having not perfumed themselves. Let's take some points of benefit. Number one, if your wife, your sister, your mother wants to go to the masjid, do not stop her. Because the Prophet ﷺ, he told us, do not prevent the female slaves of Allah from going to the masjids. But there's a condition. They may only go out if they have not perfumed themselves. If they have not perfumed themselves. In another hadith, the Prophet ﷺ, he told us that if a woman leaves her house and she is wearing perfume, then her prayer will not be accepted if she goes to the masjid. But subhanallah, you go to these places, you're standing in the cinema queue, the woman is standing 50 meters away and you can smell her because she's wearing so much perfume. She has just washed herself in her perfume. There is no subtlety about it. The Prophet ﷺ is saying, let the women go out to the masjid, but make sure they don't perfume themselves. They are going to do something good, they're going to the masjid, but they cannot perfume themselves. What about the one who is going to do something evil? There is free mixing. On top of that, she has drenched herself in her perfume. This is a big problem. Abu Usaid al-Ansari radiyallahu anh, he says that I heard the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam say when he was coming out of the masjid. Picture the scene. Masjid Nabawi, Medina, companions radiyallahu anhum. The Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he exits the masjid and he finds that the people are leaving the masjid, but as they are leaving the masjid, instead of the men being on one side and the women on the other side, which they are beginning to congregate near the middle of the road. Elements of men, some men and some women, as they are walking, they are beginning to congregate near the middle of the road. The Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he said to them, draw back, for you must not walk in the middle of the road, keep to the sides of the road. So he told the people, draw back, draw back. You must not walk in the middle of the road, rather keep to the sides of the road. And then this companion Abu Usaid al-Ansari radiallahu anh, he says, then the women were keeping so close to the sides of the road that their garments were rubbing against the walls as they walked. This hadith is in Abu Dawood. Look at how serious the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam became when he saw that men and women were congregating. Because in Islam, it's not a measure of curing the disease or curing the problem. Islam rather says prevention is better than cure. So we would rather prevent anything from happening before it even happens, close all of the doors to it altogether. So if anything is going to lead you to haram, that thing itself becomes haram and is forbidden, because it is going to lead you to haram. So you cannot congregate in the middle of the road, the Prophet ﷺ said, because it might lead to fitna, it's going to lead to trials and temptations and desires. This is the first thing, the free mixing element of going to these places. We haven't even mentioned sitting in the cinema hall next to a woman, subhanallah. The next thing, the second issue, is that it's a waste of time. It's a waste of time. How long is the average movie? Is it 20 minutes? No. Is it an hour? No, it's about an hour and a half. An hour and a half of your life, 90 minutes of your life, you sit there and you watch this rubbish. And if you go and you watch an Indian movie, a Bollywood movie, it might be 3-4 hours. So long that they have an interval in between. And the people bring their samosas and pakoras and they sit there in the interval eating. Subhanallah. 3 or 4 hours of your life have just gone. You went in before Maghrib, you missed Maghrib. You went in before Maghrib, you missed Maghrib. You come out and it's too late to pray Isha as well. Or the boys want to go for shisha after the cinema. So you go and then you smoke the shisha, because all of these things are linked. Once the shaitan becomes your friend, he will lead you from one station to the next station to the next station.